It's my great pleasure to invite you today to the first, last week we had a special seminar, but this is our first for the series that we have, Culture, Education and Post Gandhi India. It's my great pleasure to invite you today. It's my great pleasure to invite you today. It's my great pleasure to invite you today. It's my great pleasure to invite you today to the first, last week we had a special seminar, but this is our first for the series that we have, Culture, Education and Post Gandhi India, and the theme for this semester. And our first speaker, of course, is Dr. Maureen. Our next talk is going to be Mahatma Gandhi's Memorial Distinguished Lecture, and that will be on October 3rd and October 4th. So we will send out those announcements. For today's introduction, of course, many of you know Dr. Maureen. She has been a colleague since 2003, so it's about 10 years. And I've had great pleasure to work with her since she came in 2003, and she has been involved in the Center for Indian Studies. And she's going to give some of the introduction, and you will see herself, but just to put my perspective, she's an educationist. She has her, many times we of course think that and we know that she's a teacher and professor here, but what I have really learned about her is she's a perpetual learner, which is, I think, is very appropriate for today's world, that we are really learning so much all the time. And in that process of teaching and learning, I met with her and I've learned so much about education process, and I hope that we have had some very fruitful interactions during the past 10 years that we have been discussing about the education, about learning, and in this process we also introduced India. And because of my association with the Center for Indian Studies, one of the missions of our center is to present indigenous perspective of India to our 21st century students, so that there is a good understanding. And India is an ancient country, and it has ancient culture that continues. And so one has to really gaze that in a very appropriate manner, particularly from an education point of view. So I've worked with Maureen for last 10 years. Her more formal education, the introduction is that she had a PhD from University of Virginia, and she received that in 2003, and then just before she joined here. But before that, she has been a teacher for about 10 years in K through 12, where she has taught English, geography, and anything else? English and US history. So, and she has been really a great force on this campus. She got a Fulbright, which is a very prestigious fellowship, in 2010 and 11. And she really went to my village in India. She stayed in my home, and I have a small school there. There's a guest house. She interacted and continues to interact with faculty of that school and the students, and we continue to work out how to impart some of the modern education and using the ancient pedagogy to make it most effective for the students. So, with that introduction, she is going to talk today, and always she's navigating, as you can see, she's always integrating new ideas, and she will introduce a new colleague actually from psychology who is also interested in this kind of work. So we are making quite a bit of interdisciplinary work. Some of you who are on the faculty forum, UMD faculty forum, recently there was an article, I think it's in the New York Times, where they were talking about humanities and sciences, like, one is taking over the other or something of that nature. But you will see actually it's contrary to that kind of feeling. There is a more interdisciplinary work that needs to be done, And I'm trained chemist, but I can tell you that humanity is so important. I think that's the only natural science that I see. We understand it very well. Many times this kind of dichotomy is only superficial. When you really integrate yourself, and I think you will see in the presentation as well as in the experience that Dr. Hall has, is truly interdisciplinary, truly integrating ideas of humanities, sciences, education, and the society. With that introduction, I would like to invite and help you. Please help me welcome Dr. Maureen.
I hope I can live up to that introduction. Thank you, Maureen. So the title of my talk, as many of you know, is Navigating the Interconnectedness of Mindfulness, Neuroscience, and Implications for Improving Education. That's a mouthful, and it's a lot. I'm going to try to unpack some of that for you today. So maybe you saw this picture. It was on the homepage for quite a while this summer. That's myself at the Taj Mahal with my student Danielle Johansson, who expressed some interest in going to India last December. And I'm connected to a university in northern India, and they said we would love to host her, and she could come for as long as she'd like. And she went for 3.5 months and taught English communication skills to professors. So she had a wonderful experience, and I'll talk more about how that kind of was an impetus for me to start a scholarship in the name of my parents who have left their bodies, which is the Indian way of saying they're not here anymore. So a little overview. I'm going to tell you a little about me, about the definition of the scholarship of teaching and learning, which for some of you is something you know, and other people it's not quite clear, so I'll try to make that clear. Then some other important threads. One is what it means to be educated, the importance of interdisciplinary work, and also the idea of connecting neuroscience, mindfulness, and improving education. Of course, I'll talk about my connections to India, my Fulbright in India a little bit, and continuing connections. One thing I'm connected to with Balram in our continuing collaboration is the Uruguay Foundation Fellowship. And this was our 4th summer. We had teachers here that they can either get a graduate course or a stipend, and they learn about the Dharmic traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism in line with their standards in their K-12 schools, and we had people from all over the country. And also, Danielle, I mentioned briefly. We talked a little bit about my research journey and sort of the trajectory. Actually doing a talk like this sort of is a lot of self-reflection, like what am I doing and what are all the interconnections? So I know a little bit more about what I do in preparation for this talk. And there's so many interconnections, it's really, there's so many parts of my job that I love. Then I talked a little bit about a project I did with Balram on the science of Kriya Yoga, interdisciplinary work, about a new interdisciplinary project with Amindo Hare, who I'll introduce later, who's here, and then insights and further work. I have such a loud voice, I have to remember to almost whisper here, because I really don't need a microphone. Okay, so first just a little bit of gratitude, which is part of contemplative practice and mindfulness, to the Center for Indic Studies, to Dr. Balram Singh, to other supportive colleagues that I see in the audience, and to my students. And that's a picture in the Himalayas from this summer when I was there. So who am I? I'm an associate professor of education. I'm now in the STEM education and teacher development department, which I'm pretty excited about, because I've always had an interest in science, and now I'm becoming more sciencey. And you know, they say when the world gives you lemons, make lemonade. So I'm connecting more and more to science. I met Balram in 2003. Quick little anecdote, I met him, he had a yogi visiting, and so it was free yoga on campus. And I thought, well, that would be good to go to. So I went there, and I met Balram that night, and he said, oh, you're in education? Maybe you can help us, because the way the culture of India is taught in America is inaccurate in many ways. So that was the start of our collaboration. He mentioned the sabbatical that I had, and I studied the super accelerated learning theory, which basically is combining left and right brain and lots of other parts of what we know about good teaching and learning: visualization, mental practice, mnemonics, multiple intelligences, and lots of other pieces. I did write a chapter on that recently in 2012 and presented at a conference in Delhi. And since my first trip to India in 2010, I've returned 3 times, and I really feel like it's a second home for me. As Maureen said, I finished my PhD at University of Virginia in 2003, and I had 10 years of teaching experience before I went back to school for the PhD. I taught 7th and 8th grade English and Geography in Lancaster, New Hampshire, and I taught 9th, 10th, and 11th grade English and U.S. History at Keene High School in Keene, New Hampshire. So this scholarship of teaching and learning, I know one of my colleagues, Frank Scarano in MedLab Science, knows what that is, but basically, because he worked on some collaborative projects with me, but basically if you go back to 1990, Ernest Boyer talked about how traditional scholarship was referred to as the scholarship of discovery. And in 1990, he referred to another kind of scholarship, that is the scholarship of teaching. And since then, it's grown into the scholarship of teaching and learning. So to give you an example, Whitney Abel, who's a colleague in biology, she's working with another professor now, but she was working on seaweed, studying seaweed to find connections for Alzheimer's. That was her scholarship of discovery. If she did work on her own teaching, that would be the scholarship of teaching and learning. And so, in contrast to other disciplines, Lee Shulman from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, he pointed out that unlike other fields like architecture and law, where new work builds on a body of existing work, teaching is devoid of history of practice. And in some ways, we're building better research on teaching, but it's very important to raise the level of research on teaching to the same level that Whitney Abel might do in her biology research. And so a quick definition of it, and it's connected to action research. K-12 teachers do action research. They identify a problem in their teaching, they try a new pedagogical approach, and collect data on how it affects student learning, and then they make it public. So if a K-12 teacher, they don't need to publish. They might publish, but it's not necessary for them. Being in higher education, I have to publish, and so I want to share that information and help to build this history of practice. So there's some important threads here. What does it mean to be educated? I don't think that that's something that we just have a pat answer to. I think the world is changing, technology is changing. What does that mean to be an educated person? And I draw on some other people that I'll talk about some of their ideas that really engender that. But it means to see some interconnections between and among things. And I'll get to a little bit more about that later. I want to talk about the importance and benefits of interdisciplinary work, and I've done quite a bit of that, and it's been very gratifying work. And I mean, anytime you work collaboratively with a colleague and you're like-minded, whatever idea you can come up with individually is not as wonderful as what you can come up with another colleague. You can come up with a better idea, combining your expertise. And then the last thread, mindfulness, contemplative practice, neuroscience, and improving education. So what does it mean to be educated? William Cronin, who writes a lot about the American wilderness, in The American Scholar, he talks about what does it mean to be educated. And he talks about, in speaking of a liberal education, we certainly do not mean an education that indoctrinates students in the values of political liberalism, at least not in the most obvious sense. Rather, we use these words to describe an educational tradition that celebrates and nurtures human freedom. And I think that's really important, and that's part of the theme of this Center for Indic Studies series of talks, is that idea of culture and freedom, and that education should bring students new freedom to figure out what can they do in the world to make a difference. And of course, I train teachers, so a lot of my teachers, they don't go into it for the money. I know that's probably shocking to you, but they go into it to make a difference in the world. And probably you've talked to a lot of people that are career changers. They're in a job and they sort of looked at, how am I making a difference in the world? And some of them take a cut in pay because they want to make a difference in a student's life, and that's very gratifying. John Kabat-Zinn, wherever you go, there you are. He's connected to UMass, as many of you probably know, but he worked at the UMass Medical Center, and he was one of the first people to show studies that mindful-based stress reduction reduced pain in cancer patients. He's retired now, but his work is still very relevant to this. Arthur Zients, he actually came here a few years ago, and he's now the head of the Mind and Life Institute, and he talks about contemplative practice in higher education. And it's not something that you expect the whole academy to take on. It's not like that, but there are certain disciplines and certain people that see value in that, and that's the connectedness of mind, body, and spirit, which that goes back to that idea of what does it mean to be educated? You know, are we teaching a subject or are we teaching a person a subject? And isn't that relevant that we create and build and sustain relationships with the people whom we teach? Parker Palmer, my dissertation was based on a lot of his work. He talks about how you can't create community with other people until you're in community with yourself. And he talks about how, this is a quote from him, like most professionals, I was taught to occupy space, not to open it. And he talks about the importance of discussion in classrooms. We're in an embodied sense right here. We're not on Facebook chatting with each other. You're all here in your bodies, and that's a different kind of interaction that mindfulness and contemplative practice is really connected to. Martha Nussbaum talks about the importance of a liberal education. A lot of times in a recession, we have to say that we're still in a recession. A lot of times what people study have to do with what's going to get them immediately a job. Now there's nothing wrong with that, except that technology changes. And isn't it better to have someone have a wide background of knowledge so that they can learn anything, not just the skill that they learn, which may be outdated within a year or two. And Robert Waxler is in the English department, is another collaborator of mine, and we wrote a book called Transforming Literacy, Changing Lives Through Reading and Writing, and I have a short quote from us later. International views on education. Obviously, this is the Center for Indic Studies, and a lot of Eastern and Western ideas merging is really what's important in my work. Swami Vivekananda is his 150th anniversary of his birth this year, and he was one of the first Indians that came to the United States to share some of the Indian ideologies. Rabindranath Tagore, who's from Bengal, and he was a very important educator in India. Sri Aurobindo, I had the pleasure of spending a month in Pondicherry, India, which is in southeast India, in the spring of 2011 at the Aurobindo Society. And Aurobindo and the mother both work on something called integral education, which is deeply connected to the other ideas I'm talking about in terms of connecting mind, body, and spirit. And of course, Gandhi. I mean, if you had to, pin you down and say, tell me one quote from Gandhi, you'd probably say, be the change you want to see in the world, right? That's what he talks about. And of course, that's really important in terms of what does it mean to be an educated person? Because aren't we educating people to be active participants in a democratic society? We have so many rights and freedoms, and we have to make sure that people use those freedoms. The importance of interdisciplinary work, I've talked a little bit about the benefits of collegiality, coming up with better ideas together, and breaking down the sometimes artificial walls between disciplines. That's true in K through 12, it's also true in higher ed. Now, of course, someone gets hired on a tenure track, they need to focus on their discipline, but certainly every subject is connected to other subjects in a certain way, and that's a kind of understanding that students should have. That's part of what it means to be educated, to be able to see those connections, or your teacher should be the person who's helping you make those connections between and among subjects and disciplines. So a little bit about my research trajectory. Community, as I mentioned, Parker Palmer. I did a study, a qualitative study at University of Virginia of how one teacher created a community of trust in a writing classroom. And basically I had to come up with a theory of how this person created a community of trust. I could have easily found out that there was no community of trust created, and if that were the case, then my dissertation would have been about what prevented community from happening. That led me to cognitive affective learning. And basically, cognitive affective learning is the idea that when you learn, you don't separate cognition from emotion. You have a learning experience. Probably all of us can think of some teacher that we've had over the course of our lives who is really excited about a subject matter, and that excitement about that subject matter, and content knowledge, we hope, not just excitement, inspired students, inspired them to learn more, maybe to become a historian, maybe to become a teacher, maybe to work in engineering, whatever it was. But cognitive affective learning is something that, you can't just have the subject, the cognition. You have to think about the pedagogy of it and how is that going to create a more educated individual. That led me to contemplative practices and pedagogy. And of course, the roots are from India, which is the next one, and those are kind of talk about those together. But I became a member of the Contemplative Mind and Society, which I have a slide from them later. But it's in Northampton, Massachusetts, and it's talking about all of the contemplative traditions in the world. There's also the Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, which is the very awkward acronym of ACME, and I belong to that as well. And that's creating connections between and among educators across higher education who are interested in this idea of teaching to and from the whole person. And then that led me to mindfulness, neuroscience, and improving education. And when I talk about my connection with Aminda O'Hare, I sort of feel like that's manifesting this semester, which is really exciting. So just about interdisciplinary work, these are all the people. Actually, Frank Scarano, could you stand up? That's Frank, who's in MedLab Science. Paul Ram, you already met. So Aminda O'Hare is right there. So Jan Burgundy's not here. Laucia Silva. Olivia Archibald is a person I met through the Carnegie Foundation in 2006, and we have a book coming out next year together. Robert Waxler's in the English department here, and I've had a partnership with him working with students in alternative high schools in the area, New Bedford and Fall River, since 2006, and that's what our book was about in 2011, Transforming Literacy. Many of you might know about the Changing Lives Through Literature program, which is basically what we did is we took the same literature from that and we used it with students in alternative high schools in the area, and with good results. Robert Pate was a professor at University of Virginia who was teaching about counseling and spirituality. I was a graduate student with him for a while and actually had a publication with him about counseling and spirituality online course that we taught together, and Aminda in psychology. So on to mindfulness, contemplative practice, neuroscience, and improving education. Mindfulness is a form of contemplative practice. Just out of curiosity, and you don't have to raise your hand, but how many of you have some sort of yoga, breathing techniques, meditation that you do at least once a week? So actually, almost everyone here. So, right, so I don't have to put my beginner's mind on, because many of you already understand some of the benefits, at least personally, that mindfulness or contemplative practice might have for you. The roots of contemplative practice are from India, a culture that's 5,000 years old. And the idea that neuroscience and education together, they hold dynamic possibilities for improving education. It's funny, right now, the course that I'm co-teaching with Aminda, which is an MAT 610, Educational Research and Technology, which I'll talk about more. One of my students the other night, who's a practicing teacher, he said, you know, a couple of years ago, there were all these initiatives about brain-based learning. And he said, as if you're going to learn with some other organ. He was really upset about that. And I'm like, I know, okay, so. But there was a big push for that. But it's still really important. I mean, unfortunately, kind of going back to Boyer's idea, that in some ways, research and education has been susceptible to fads and unproven practices, and we're trying to improve the rigor of the research and education so that best practices can be found out through education. So contemplative practice, I don't really need to tell you what it is, but basically it refers to a range of activities that emphasize a grounding and habitation in the present moment. Many of you do some sort of contemplative practice. It regards the learning process holistically, and naturally the learning process encompasses both thoughts and feelings, a connection to cognitive affective learning. A contemplative pedagogy attempts to quiet the chaos and distractions inherent in a modern life in the name of the best teaching and learning. And I'm just going to show you a bell that I have. This bell. I went to a couple of retreats with the Contemplative Mind and Society, one in 2007 in New York at the Menla Center where the Dalai Lama visits, and also one in California. And Arthur Zions had this cool bell, and I just thought I could do like a, kind of a contemplative practice at the beginning of each class. So I have this Buddhist bell. But what I say to my students the first class is I ask them, as if you're my first class, is anyone out there not breathing? Okay, so everybody's breathing? Okay, good. Because we're going to breathe to this bell, and this is a Buddhist bell, but I'm using it in a secular way. So at the beginning of every class that I teach since 2007, all I do is ring the bell 3 times, we breathe in and out. So I won't ring it 3 times, and I sort of feel like I'm in a rush, which is not mindful, but, and then I give them a prompt for whatever the reading was for that day. So then they write, which is a contemplative practice. It's a contemplative writing or reflective writing that connects them to the discussion that we're going to have in an embodied sense. So they might have had some ideas, they write it down, and I've gotten good feedback from students saying, you know what I like about the writing at the beginning of the class is I already know what I'm going to say. So then when we share, I can listen to somebody else because I'm not raising my hand waiting to see if I'll get called on. I can really listen. And I think listening is such an important piece of contemplative practice as well. Here's the tree of contemplative practices, which I know you can't see all of it. But if you look up here, there's stillness practices, activist practices. So there's meditation, there's walking, all sorts of different kinds of practices. And this is from the contemplativemind.org. And it's great. If you're doing any writing about contemplative practices, you can always use this image in your writing. It's totally free for anybody to use without gaining any copyright information. But it organizes some contemplative practices into some different parts. So I'm going to give an example of interdisciplinary work with Balram. He teaches a course called The Science of Kriya Yoga, which is part of the minor in Indic studies that we offer here at UMass Dartmouth. And so he uses yoga and meditation to teach scientific concepts to students. And so he wanted me to do a formative evaluation of his course. Well, I'm in education, and we do formative evaluations of student learning. So I asked him to identify a problem he wanted to investigate and also what he wanted to know about his students' learning. And the problem he identified was that students didn't understand themselves scientifically. And so we collected data over 2 semesters, and I collected data from students several times over the semester the course was first offered and the second semester. And the question I asked them was, prompted by Balram, to what extent and in what ways do you understand yourself in a scientific way through this course? He also collected data. Who are you and who is your ideal, which he collected at the beginning and the end of the class, and coding it so he would know which students answered, in the first round and what they answered at the end of the class without disclosing their names. And what we found, what I found in my qualitative data in response to that question, tell me to what extent you understand yourself scientifically, there were 3 distinct themes that emerged from the data. That the body was a learning tool, that there were integrated concepts of self, mind, and body, and the interconnectedness of all things. These 3 themes are evidenced by particular quotes, which I'm called from the data and are representative of the larger findings. We also created a model for assessment, which I'll show you first and then go back. Krathwohl, probably any heard of Krathwohl? You ever heard of Krathwohl? The Krathwohl affective domain. It's from the same year that Bloom's taxonomy came out. In fact, Bloom wrote with Krathwohl, but it was about affective learning. So I said to Balram, should we use that when we measure our findings qualitatively? And he said, no, let's make our own assessment model. So this is our assessment model, which you can see ideals and concepts, contemplative practice and integration, and on the left side, body, mind, self-realization, way of learning, and new understanding of scientific approach. And I told you again, just so some of my colleagues that don't know the name of my new department, because we've merged with STEM, is STEM Education and Teacher Development. And you see, I already have some science connections. So, in terms of scholarship of teaching and learning, we created this new assessment model, and then we do have the article accepted in an international interdisciplinary journal that will come out in December of this year. So, Aminda O'Hare, we are doing a project together And our project title is Neural and Classroom Learning Assessments of Cognitive Improvements Following Training in Contemplative Practices. Our planning started in early 2013. We met through, I think, an Office of Faculty Development seminar and kind of realized that we had a lot of similar interests and maybe that some of our interests in research might connect with each other. So we're working with my graduate education course, MAT 610, Educational Research and Technology. And actually this particular section of this course is part of a National Science Foundation grant already, and it's focusing on promoting the development of teacher leaders. And we see this project as a gateway to further work and grant funding opportunities. I will be applying for the Avant Singh grant this fall. It's due November 1st, and it's going to be connecting contemplative practice and neuroscience, and sort of looking at contemplative practice as coming from India and neuroscience as more focused in America or the West. And it connects an Indian university with an American university. And I'm very connected to that university in northern India called Dev Sanskriti, which is a wonderful place, and I've been collaborating with them. That's where Danielle, my student, went to teach. So I borrowed from Aminda's page here. She's there. I know she likes my colors because she likes green and has beautiful orange hair. And so she's an assistant professor here in psychology. She's been here since 2012. And her research focuses on affective cognitive neuroscience. And she's the principal investigator of the CAPES lab on campus, Cognitive and Affective Psychophysiology of Experimental Science, say that 5 times fast, here at UMD. She uses event-related potentials, ERP techniques, to investigate cognition and emotion interactions. So more about this project. Aminda and her graduate student, Evan Ames, will be coming in starting on September 25th for 8 weeks, and they're going to do a mindfulness training with my students. So starting last week and up until September 25th, they've all signed up to come in for a 2-hour pre-measure in Aminda's lab, which is actually in the textile building right next door here. And so they have to put a shower cap on with electrodes and a little bit of gel, and for 2 hours, and we collect some data about what's happening in their brains, and of course we will also do that at the end, the post measures, and we have a lot of other different kinds of measures, qualitative measures about their teaching that we're going to work on. The goals of this project are to increase secondary education teachers' understanding of contemplative practices in education, both in terms of how these practices can deepen student learning and also enhance the teaching self. Education and educational approaches in today's standardized testing-focused climate neglect the kinds of learning that integrate mind, body, and spirit. This Scholarship of Teaching and Learning research project identifies the problem inherent in teaching practices that neglect the integration of mind, body, and spirit. As Waxler and Hall, 2011, outlined, quote, teachers who utilize contemplative practices connect with their students as whole persons, reaching their students on an emotional as well as an intellectual level, end quote. Any learning event has both cognitive and affective dimensions, and these dimensions cannot simply be separated. An 8-week training regime was selected as this time frame has been shown to change both behavioral and neural outcomes in human participants. And if you want to see a review, you can look at Hosel of 2011. So, actually I have to go back to the beginning because I have a Rumi poem that I want to share with you. How many of you know this poem? Do any of you know this poem? Okay, great. The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Sorry, my formatting. It's by Rumi, and it's translated by a guy named Coleman Barks, who's a pretty cool character. I think he's from Tennessee or Kentucky, but he's done a lot of translations of Rumi's poems. Now, why would I pick this poem? Well, in the poem, it sort of evidences what you do when you're mindful. You're taking things moment to moment. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've calmed down a little bit since I got here. My friend Coyle helped me with my sari, which was a little bit of a production, partly because there's a lot of parking problems around here and trying to get someplace is involved. I saw these folks in the second row who saw me in a different outfit not long ago. But, you know, the idea of being mindful, you do have to be calm. And, you know, there are lots of studies about how learning is better when students are calm. And so that's not the only reason to do mindfulness, but it's certainly, if it promotes and improves learning, there's a good reason to do it. So connecting pedagogies of East and West. And I know there's a lot of undergraduates here, and you might say, what is that crazy word, pedagogy? Well, pedagogy is how you teach. It has to do with teaching. So if you're thinking about becoming a teacher, you have to have content knowledge if you're going to be a history teacher, and you have to have pedagogy. So you have to learn how people learn so that you can teach them well. So Rumi's poem asks the reader to accept what comes moment to moment. That is a big challenge as an academic, or a K-12 teacher, or as a student, because your training is constantly asking you to make critical judgments. And mindfulness is to let judgment go, to look at things moment to moment and acknowledge them, but let them pass, because, you know, you're not your thoughts. That's not who you really are at the deepest level. Those thoughts are passing through just like clouds, so that's important. Mindfulness, like other present moment activities, is an embodied activity where a person focuses on the inside. And this idea of interiority, that comes from Tobin Hart, who talks about interiority. I think that's his word. It's nothing new. It comes from the wisdom traditions of the world, and many of them originate in India. And these inner technologies may be activated through mindfulness practices, including but not limited to active listening, yoga, meditation, respectful dialogue, and reflective writing. This is just a slide about our Uberoi presentation, so if you happen to know any K-12 teachers, or if you are a K-12 teacher in the area or beyond, and you might know somebody in another state, this is our 4th summer of training teachers in Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism, so that they understand accurately what these dharmic traditions are. They are in the standards, but they're not taught accurately, and so we help to improve and deepen learning of those dharmic traditions. Here I am at the Taj Mahal again. This is about the scholarship that I created in the spring. Now Danielle, my student who's standing next to me, I was not able to give her the scholarship because she's the one who prompted me to create the scholarship. So she was already going to India. So I gave her a little scholarship of my own, just $500, which is what I'm going to give going forward now. And basically, both of my parents were educators. So it's in tribute to them. Now, as an academic, it's funny, one of my MAT 610 students said to me the other day, well, why are you doing all this publishing? And I was like, well, I'm in higher ed, and that's what you have to do. You teach and you do research and you publish. So I said to Balaram earlier, I said, I feel like this is a little bit of belly button gazing, but these are all the things that I've done with other people. Okay? I have a book coming out with Olivia Archibald called Writing from the Inside, The Power of Reflective Writing, which came out of the Carnegie Foundation, which Frank Sperano, Glesia Silva, Shannon Jenkins, myself, and Deirdre Healy were a part of. I was the leader of that group, connected us with 7 other institutions around the nation where people were focused on cognitive affective learning. She teaches in Washington State, so most of the writing that we've done has been through email. We've also visited each other a few times to do some embodied writing. Bob Waxler in the English department, I feel so fortunate to work with him. There's not anyone I know in this world who is more passionate about literature. Balaram, I'm writing this article that's coming out, or a written article that's coming out in December 2013. Jan Burgundy in computer and information sciences. We did something on unified modeling language. We did a study of what were teachers' attitudes towards technology, and attitudes are cognitive and affective dimensions of learning. Attitudes, motivation, lack of motivation, engagement, lack of engagement, all of those things are part of cognitive and affective learning. So those are the folks that I've done work with. And also, I've won some grants in interdisciplinary work. With Balram, he was the leader. I did not, wasn't involved in the writing of that grant, but I have been involved as the teacher facilitator for the past 4 summers for the Uberoi. And then the Carnegie Leadership Program that I just mentioned, I had to find 4 other folks on campus. Now this is an interesting grant. You didn't get any money for it, but you had to get a letter from the provost saying he would pay for your travel to and from the meetings over 3 years. So that is money. So I also got to travel a bit in terms of ways to go other places, because we're having a dialogue here, but as a faculty member, you should have connections inside and outside your institution, because there's all sorts of conversations about what you're interested in going on lots of different places in the world. And I've actually won 3 Chancellor Public Service grants, but they're only, one of them was by myself on differentiated instruction. And these other 2, one was with Bob Waxler about building a new neighborhood. We worked at the former West Side School in New Bedford that was closed down, but we did some important work. My students did 1,300 hours of tutoring there, and we were seeing some positive changes, but they closed the school. I told them that some of those kids would be able to do Changing Lives Through Literature after some of them were incarcerated. That's what I told the school board. Bob Waxler said, lay low before tenure. And I think it said in the Standard Times before I got tenure that I slammed the school board in New Bedford. So he started calling me the slammer. So anyway, I was able to get tenure even though I slammed. Maybe I should have slammed the New Bedford school board, so I don't know. The other one was with Jan Burgundy, and that had to do with unified modeling language, which is a graphic language that's used in computer science. And the problem with that, or the problem that we addressed, is that so many students, when they come in for computer science or engineering, don't have the problem-solving skills that they need when they get here. And of course, any good teacher needs to teach to the students where they are. They need to have goals for them. But they can't just blame the students, oh, they don't know anything. You have to start where they are and bring them along, and that's what a good teacher does. A good teacher sees possibilities in a student that student doesn't see for him or herself, and that's very important. I would say that that's a cognitive affective dimension of teaching. So just revisiting some threads, I probably don't need to, but it's always good to sort of say what you're going to say and then say it again at the end, right? So what does it mean to be educated? I think it's something, that question is something that we need to keep asking ourselves as students, as teachers, as professors. All those roles need to continually ask, what does it mean to be an educated person in this world? Because sometimes it changes, and so teaching should change in response to that. Interdisciplinary work, it can be a really wonderful kind of work, and even when I was a 7th and 8th grade teacher in northern New Hampshire, I did some team teaching, and it can be really wonderful or really awful. I mean, I choose to work with the people I'm working with. Sometimes in K through 12 they put people together and they don't let some choice be in place, and that's, everybody wants agency and choice. So if you get to choose who you want to work with, it can be a really wonderful, and gratifying professional development, and can lead to publications and research and improvement in your teaching. And then mindfulness, contemplative practice, neuroscience, and improving education. So sort of on the frontier of connecting all of these things. I feel, like I said, I felt like this was a reflective practice of just creating this presentation to sort of tell the story of what I'm interested in and what are the connections and the interconnections. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So questions or comments? I just have a picture of Danielle, and the woman in the middle is from Australia that we met in Badrinath. We were in the Himalayas this summer. Luckily, we left there a week before the floods, and we were lucky that we weren't there. Some terrible flooding and lots of loss of life, and but what a beautiful place to be. So, questions? Are you going to pass around a microphone or something, Paul? Yeah.
Other questions?
Or comments?
Or comments? No questions? Dr. Satyapuraitam, he had his class here too.
Right, exactly. We have some Center for Indic Studies folks in the room, I know.
This is a very interesting presentation.
Thank you very much.
In fact, these terms, effective and cognitive, in fact, I am associated with these terms in my research because my research has been on cognitive trust and affective trust. And I use these as two separate constructs. And now your paper gave an idea of having cognitive affective trust, which is not discussed in the trust literature at all. What we do is that cognitive affective trust will lead to the cognitive trust, because these are two different constructs. Similarly here, I do not know about this, your literature review in this case. Cognitive learning and affective learning. Did you ever think these were separate constructs?
There's a lot of people who think they're separate, but I don't happen to think they're separate. I don't think that when you learn, I don't know how you can separate the experience that you have, you know, how motivated you are, what are you interested in the subject? Is there something that, you know, you want to develop an expertise in? I mean, I think sometimes I see that as a problem. I don't think that, you know, contemplative practice and mindfulness is going to take over the world. I think there are going to be certain people that use it and use it very effectively. And I think it may inform a lot of teaching practices, but I think that a lot of times it is thought to be very separate. Yeah. But my bias is that it's always together.
This is what I thought was, you know, effective learning. You know, I would like to learn this effective learning, emotional. Whereas cognitive is that I have to learn intelligence, you know, that the cognition makes me to learn, because unless I study, I cannot make 4.2 GPA. That is cognitive. Affective learning is I am really genuinely interested emotionally in learning. And by clubbing these two gave me a wonderful platform for me to combine these two in my literature also.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, a connection to that, Glaucia Silva, who teaches in Portuguese, who's also the head of the Office of Faculty Development right now, she's across the hallway. I'm in education, but we're across the hallway from the Portuguese professors, and she's literally right across the hallway from me. And so I was able to convince her to connect with the cognitive affective learning, and I'll give you an example of what problem she addressed. She was teaching an introductory course in Portuguese, and the problem she was finding was that the students were not interested in learning about the culture of Brazil and Portugal and the Portuguese, all the Portuguese cultural elements. And so what she did is she partnered up with second graders who were native speakers of Portuguese in Framingham. And so her students would make PowerPoints about cultural events, and then they would send them to the second graders in Framingham. And the Framingham native speakers of Portuguese would write back to them in Portuguese. And so what she found was that really enhanced the cognitive affective learning. It addressed that idea that they weren't that interested. Now they had an audience, and the second graders were just as excited as the college kids were to partner up with each other. And so that was an example. Frank Serrano in MedLab Science talks about what are the cognitive affective dimensions of being a medical laboratory professional. And that there's, you know, when you're working in a lab with people, that there's a certain kind of professional posturing, not even posturing is a negative word, an identity that you have to develop, and that's a part of cognitive affective learning. So. Any other questions? Shiva?
According to Bloom's taxonomy, there are three domains, right? Cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Do you reflect on our domain as well?
Well, I don't think, I think like in any psychological perspective, if you had a whole bunch of psychologists and psychiatrists here, they're not going to all agree on the constructs of personality and how you learn, right? In fact, they wouldn't be able to publish if they all agreed, right? I mean, that's not why they disagree. But I was going to call up the, I didn't have that. I can find actually, I can find the craft wall thing, which I want to talk to you about for a minute. Here it is. So this is from 1964. This is the Kraftwall affective domain, which is what Olivia Archibald and I used in our, we wrote a paper together. We did a study called Contemplative Practices in Creative Writing and Education Classes, play of theory and practice in 3 acts. And so we chose this affective tool, just like from 1964. UMass Dartmouth is from 1964. I also incarnated the universe in 1964. So anyway, so if you look at these, if you think of the bottom line, the receiving, that's actually level, what we thought of as level 1. That if you're trying to give up a bad habit, maybe you're trying to stop smoking, or maybe you're trying to start a good habit, maybe you're trying to do a practice of mindfulness once a day, and you're really trying to stay true to that. You have to receive, you have to value, you have to receive that first. You have to understand about it. Then you have to respond to it. That's level 2. Then you have to value it. Then it's organization, and level 5 is that you've integrated into your life. So in the that we did, we found that 30 of the 32 students at the conclusion of the project valued a practice of reflective writing at the beginning of class. That's what we did. These 30 students had moved beyond Kraftwall's level 1 category, receiving and awareness of reflective writing. They'd also moved beyond Kraftwall's level 2 category, since they didn't just respond to the writing prompts, but in their responses, they valued the experience, level 3 of Kraftwall's affective domain taxonomy. A total of 14 of the students indicated they would like to integrate reflective writing into their lives after the course was over, level 4 in Kraftwall's taxonomy. They internalized the experience to the degree that they wanted it within their lives after the course was over. What was unclear at the conclusion of the project was determining if students would use reflective writing consistently in their lives and commit to it as a life practice. And that's what the characterization by value set represents. So, you know, it's an interesting question, Shiva. I think, you know, it's not just those 3 domains that Bloom said. In fact, Bloom did publish some work with Kraftwall, but it's a different way to think about it. In fact, there aren't that many ways or constructs that I know of. Perhaps Aminda knows of more of them, or she's finding out more of them, on how we can measure cognitive affective learning in a qualitative sense. Certainly, there's a lot of quantitative ways that we can measure it. So thank you for that question.
This is to confirm Rumi's statement. 72 minutes every morning before the sunrise, the waves around all human beings are elevated. He goes to the level from senses, he pulls back to the mind. Further you pull back, you end up into the intellect. And further pulling in, which is really meditation, ends up in the soul. And when I end up myself, at that moment, I cannot identify myself as my name, my nation, my caste. I become soul. And soul does not have independent, automatically the knowledge starts from internal source illuminating before you. And this science was explained about 5,000 years ago by Yoga Darshan, Patanjali's Yoga Darshan, the meditation, science of meditation. And that experience gives you the knowledge from a different source. It is an internal way of gaining the knowledge, and there is an external way of gaining the knowledge. The external way has been practiced in the West for long, and therefore we continue the external observations, experiments, and logic, things like that. So there is an internal way of knowing as well. I just wanted to make that comment.
I really appreciate that. How long have you been meditating? I'm just curious.
I don't think it is how long.
Like how many years?
I've been meditating for a number of years, but I won't be able to put the number on that. The quality of meditation goes on, because when you identify, it is like a car. If car is in the reverse gear, it only goes in that gear. So if mind, I'm using the word mind in the broader sense, if the mind has brought to the level of soul, it does not identify with anything else. It just identifies with the soul. And because of this, the Indian philosophies were always broad-minded. Because they went to the level of soul, and whatever lighted on them, if they never put a stamp of Hinduism or India on things like that. And that became universal. So this is what
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that, because I think you captured the idea of West versus East, and this idea of, in a way, in the West, we learn from the outside in. And if you're doing the practices in India, or if they come from India, you don't have to be in India to do them, then you're learning from the inside out. And I think you captured that. I'm glad this is taped, because I want to look at what you said again, because it really resonated with me. Thank you.
So I think continuing a little bit with that, there may be actually a contradiction in what you have been saying. Cognitive, affective, of course, which is more emotional and trying to recognize things. But more, then you say mindfulness, which kind of goes with it. But what Professor Kaveri is saying and what I think is the overall goal of yoga, if you want, including the word that I take, is to be able to see through you the whole world. It means you have to detach yourself. It means you're not going to actually say mindlessness rather than mindfulness. Because
that's going to be a hard sell with the Commissioner of Education.
You also said yourself that you do not want the thoughts, because with your bell, actually, you try to get them away from all kind of thoughts that they have.
Yeah.
So actually, you're basically focusing them, and then I think what Professor Zaveri is saying, then once you get to that state, then there is a state that you do not even have that. You do not have to pay attention to your bell, and then the knowledge appears if you practice long enough. So I think maybe there is some thought.
Yeah. I think the idea too that it's a practice, just a quick anecdote, there's a woman named Mirabai Bush who was one of the facilitators at the first retreat that I went to, and she was telling us at the second retreat that she'd been hired by Google to do some contemplative practices with the workers at Google. And so she went in one time and she did yoga with them. And then she went another time and she did some mindful breathing. And then she did some meditation, and then she repeated some of those things. And the first time she repeated something, there was a woman, one of the Google workers, raised her hand and she said, we've already done that. Well, the point is, it's a practice. You don't get to the end of it It's a practice. So you do it, you know, and I always say, you know, be a little leery of people that say, oh, I'm really good at meditating. You know, to stop your thoughts. I know, Balram, you've meditated every morning for how many years? Not that it matters, but I guess I'm quantitative in a little way.
Maybe 14 years.
14 years, yeah. But every day is different, right? I mean, it's not like, oh, I got really good at it and now I don't have to do it anymore. You know, so it's a practice. I think that's an interesting piece to it, and that's, you know, to get to the state that you're talking about, which would be the hard sell, like, hey, if you do enough mindfulness, you'll forget who you are. You know? So I'm like, all right, how am I going to sell that, you know, in the school systems? But I know what you're saying, because it's a whole different way of looking at how we perceive the world and how we gain knowledge. But see, even using the word gain, it's that if you go further enough inside yourself, far enough inside yourself, that you will know things. You're seeing the world because you are, you know, watching yourself. That idea of meditating, which oftentimes, you know, you have a difficult colleague and you say, am I going to say something? And then you're like, no, I better watch myself. Do I want to have that interaction, that bad interaction with a colleague? No. So I'm going to stop for a minute because I'm watching myself, right? I haven't always done that. But again, you know, I am the slammer from the school board in New Bedford. So Aminda, you know, she's probably going to kill me, but she's a really calm person. And I said to her the other day, I said, I wonder what my career would look different if I was always calm. And so it's one of those questions like, what does it mean to be educated? So we have to keep asking ourselves that.
I think that there are some elements that are there, whatever you're presenting. You said interiority. So that what really, exactly when it gets its ultimate goal, that's where it refers to. Also coming from sciences, we really do not want to be mindful.
Include me, I'm in the sciences now, Laura.
Okay. We do not want to be mindful of what I am so that I see the data. Actually, we intentionally make sure that we are not affecting that at all. And so the detachment from the observation is very, very important. And I think to get to that level, I think everyone has to practice. I agree with you.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of paradoxes in my talk, and not to explain it away by this, but Parker Palmer says part of being educated is being able to hold two things up that are completely opposite and understand them both. There's something to that. So, again, a piece of, I think, what it means to be educated, to be able to look broadly at things and look at things that don't make sense. There's one last anecdote, because I think it's pretty funny, but yesterday I came in to teach over in the Liberal Arts Building, and so there were lots of beautiful yellow posters in color of me jumping at the Taj Mahal for this talk. I want to get one off the wall, by the way, and for, you know, for posterity, right, or something. And so I walked into the Liberal Arts Building, and stapled over my flyer was a back-to-school nail special. So I didn't get upset. I mean, what's the point of that? There was another student standing there, and I said, oh, I'm giving this talk, and I'm just going to undo those staples and put at least so you can see the title of my talk. I mean, the back-to-school nail special, it was very important, too.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you so much. Very nice talk.
Thank you very much.